right, guys, welcome back to the H2G podcast. As we know, we've been getting into some more serious topics lately. So this is going to be a part of a 3-part series. So this is going to be part 1 of us discussing human trafficking. And I know a lot of people typically associate human trafficking with something that maybe happens overseas. I know a lot of people have seen the movie Taken. That's usually the first thing that comes to mind. But what a lot of people don't realize is that that's a prevalent issue here in the United States too. It's just usually kind of brushed under the rug. So I kind of wanted this to be more of like an educational thing, but also somewhere that we can kind of discuss things. It might bring about some topics that maybe I hadn't thought of to even include. But for this first part, we're going to talk about the psychology behind it, how people, end up kind of getting suckered into it, because it isn't always that you get, kidnapped off the street out of nowhere or at a rest stop off of a highway, which is a concern, by the way. But sometimes it is something where people are actually coerced into it. So I think starting out, I'm going to kind of just go around the horn here and get any input, because I know a lot of people don't have a lot of background in studying this. This is something that I studied in college, and I volunteer for human trafficking organizations that help rescue women out. So I guess let's kind of go around the horn, and then either you can share some kind of perspective that maybe you have for the area that you live in, or maybe you just want to ask questions or something to me, or pick a topic to further discuss that maybe I can help clarify. So let's go ahead and start with Justin.
How do I know these things, that it was coming my way? So this is super serious. I had to do research and prep for this, so not nearly as woke to the situation as someone would be. But I do know, speaking off script, which is always a dangerous thing, that Toledo and the Findlay area and these areas in like rural Ohio that I've been living, it's been a huge problem, human trafficking. They've uncovered trucks full of people just down the road from me. So it really is localized. It's everywhere, kind of like you said, which is what was the most eye-opening to me about the research I was doing, was how prevalent it is in our country, and probably right around the corner from you, and you don't even know it. You mentioned the rest stops things. I mean, think about how many times you stopped at a rest stop, just on any trip. So some of the stuff that I pulled up is probably more better, probably going to be better suited for interjection later. But just on a general basis, I'm interested to hear about some of the ways that people are coerced, because I think you're absolutely hitting the nail on the head when people have like a general perspective of this, that it's always like Taken, or it's always these young college girls going off to a party. It's not even specifically sex. I mean, traditionally, not even traditional, that's a bad word for this, but it's everyone. There's people being forced into slavery. There's people forced into jobs that they don't want to do, uncomfortable living situations, terrible wages for absurd amount of work, slavery, so it's very broad. It's a huge topic, and I'm glad that we're going to take some time to go over it. But just as a beginning point for me, I'm interested to hear about some of the ways that people are getting sucked into this.
Yeah. And I like that you touched on where you're at in Ohio, because Ohio, when I first started studying this, I believe was number 5 in the country. It's now number 3, I believe, based on the data I just pulled up. And I think Florida is actually number 1, which was the state I lived in before Texas. So I mostly studied sex trafficking. But yes, it is an issue with actual labor as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Riche.
Yeah, I will leave the sex trafficking up to Chelsea, quite frankly. But good point. This is the International Labor Organization. It's a lot of labor as well. And so how does we're talking about the psychology. How does this kind of happen? Well, a lot of the times I'm going to lead into one example. There's many, but just what's prominent in California. So in the state of California, what's very prominent is a lot of Hispanic migrants kind of get brought in. And so there's a term called people smuggling, and it's the idea that somebody gets brought over the border, smuggled into the United States. Now, that can be from any country. It's not just like, Hispanic countries, but just giving you a quick example, we'll just say Mexico for the sake of the argument. Somebody in Mexico, right? Their whole family, under the promise of this criminal, an emphasis on criminal, and we'll get to that in a minute, tells them that their child or this person will have a better life and be able to bring that to the rest of the family down the road. So they save up for like 2-3 years, save up enough money to be able to make this trip and get smuggled by this criminal, essentially. Now, again, does the family know this person's a criminal? No, they're living in pure poverty and they're trying to come up and have a better life. So they're looking at it as an opportunity for their child to have success. So what ends up happening is they travel the border, and this is where multiple different things can happen. As we just discussed, sexual trafficking can happen, but a lot of times it's also just considered forced labor, right? It's not necessarily just sex. It can be forced labor. It can be menial work where they're either not getting paid or getting paid such a small amount that the person's taking such a massive cut. And the other thing that usually tends to happen in trafficking, which is where they get trapped, and kind of the psychology of it, Chelsea will probably be able to explain this better. But at the end of the day, they live in an environment where it tends to be, a small apartment for 1 to 2 people, and between 8 and 12 people may be there. And it's these people that have been trafficked and they're stuck in there. And then when the person wants to leave, or when they realize, what's kind of going on, and it usually takes a while. But when they get to that point, the trafficker, the criminal, tends to do things like, oh, I know your family, I know where they live, I know your social security, or I have your falsified social security. You've been living here for this many months and I haven't been charging you rent. So now here's a debt you have to pay off. They find ways to manipulate the people and the victims to make them feel like there's absolutely no way out. And that's, at the end of the day, the ideology, regardless of the scope of how the trafficking and what kind of labor and force is happening. So out here, it's very prominent in California in both sex trafficking, particularly near where I live. And unfortunately, it hasn't been something that the police know about it and they do nothing at the end of the day. A lot of organizations know about it and they do nothing. So it's very frustrating because I've called hotlines and I see all these poor women that are out here and nobody does anything. So it feels hopeless. Our police in Oakland, every couple years, I'm not even joking, you can look this up, they get criminally investigated and they get purged and new police show up. So every single time this criminal department of police do nothing. So it's, we still report and nothing happens because they have bigger things to deal with than human beings being trafficked, which obviously I don't agree with that. But nonetheless, it's a reality that I see every single morning and every single night. There are women out there at 6 a.m, and then there are women out there at 6 p.m. So it doesn't matter what time of the day, when I'm driving in my neighborhood, I see those trafficked women. And in addition to that, I know for a fact there are trafficked labor. So it's very discouraging. I'm glad Chelsea's bringing this topic up because I do think there's a lot of people who kind of have the blinders, right? You might really have a very broad scope of the idea of sex trafficking, like Taken and things like that, or you've seen it in a movie. But I don't think you realize how much forced labor occurs, not in just the United States, but clearly globally. I mean, it's absolutely a problem. It's one of, as Justin kind of mentioned, it's one of the most profitable things in the world, quite frankly. They make a killing, and anyone who does trafficking, let's just clarify that they are criminal. These are large criminal organizations that are doing this. This isn't like a 6-person operation. I mean, this is like gangs, massive organizations. This is high level stuff. This isn't small people doing these things. So it's a huge problem. It's quite frankly disgusting because, we talk about it here in terms of slavery. I mean, and that's a strong word to say, but it's slavery. And it's something that this country's already done, quite frankly. But that's what this is. This is slavery. This is forced labor. Now, what the labor is can be different things. But at the end of the day, the best they get is they get a place to stay, right? Oh, you get to live under my roof. That's slavery. There's nothing different in that sense. So a lot of the times it's similar to what I would consider forced slavery. Slavery is still a thing today in society. In the United States, it is as well, people, like just a different type than you're used to. So I really am looking forward to hearing some other perspectives, and hopefully we can get more into the psychology and Chelsea break it down. But I just want to give a personal, recollection of what goes on in my neighborhood on a day-to-day, and that is what goes on. There's a lot of immigrants who've tried to make themselves a better life that are doing, really extremely hard labor that we pay at my company about $22 an hour. and they're not even making money, right? Like we just discussed, they're living in an apartment with 10 other people that's like 500 square feet, and that's what they're dealing with. So it's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah, and you kind of touched on too the psychology a little bit with the manipulation that goes into keeping people, and that's not just labor trafficking, that's also sex trafficking. There's a whole psychology side to it. But yeah, I mean, especially if you think about, you know, people who are watching this, if your native language is English and you were to be trafficked into a country where the native language is something other than English, it's really hard for you to decipher what is being told to you is true versus not. It's going to be hard for you to understand what they're saying to you anyway, unless they're fluent English speakers, and they're probably intentionally making it more difficult for you. So I think it's really easy for people to be like, well, why don't you just get out? And it's like, well, it's not that easy. They hold your family and your loved ones over your head. They're basically threatening them because they have their address and know exactly where they live. And, you know, they start making up all these reasons why you can't leave. You now owe them a debt, you know, something like that. In the cases of sex trafficking, sometimes it's drug addiction. They will intentionally get these women addicted to drugs. And the money that they earn goes to the pimp, and they then give an allowance to the women. And so they literally have no source of income or no way to get out, because they do not manage their own money. They don't have anything for themselves. I'll go ahead and pass it off to Marvin. Got anything to share?
No, that's really deep perspectives by all three of you. I know in Ohio, Chelsea, like you were saying, sex trafficking is very prevalent, you know, back home, and it's becoming a huge, you know, problem. And like you said, a lot of these women get trapped, and you know, they really have no source of income or really no means of getting out of the situation. So, I mean, I don't really, you know, have a, you know, solution that I could come up with, you know, at the moment, you know, in terms of, I feel like this is, you know, something that shouldn't go overlooked any longer. You know, you have to get, you know, more of you know, you have to get more law enforcement involved, I feel, you know, because if you crack down on, you know, the criminals that really are, you know, in charge of like these organizations, or really, you know, just one-on-one, you know, controlling these women, I really feel like there really needs to be a crackdown. But, you know, it's, you know, I know in New York, it's, you know, it's really prevalent here, you know, human trafficking, you know, from, you know, the stories I've heard from, you know, in Chinatown, you know, you never know like who is like legit and who isn't, like, you know, like, but, you know, I wish I had more to offer on the subject. I just know that, you know, from my experience, you know, back home, I know that it's becoming a huge issue, you know, along with here in New York. And I wish, you know, there needs to be more laws that kind of enforce, you know, help, you know, for these women. It's really, it's getting off.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, I don't think a lot of people realize how prevalent of an issue it is. And again, most of my background is in sex crimes and human trafficking. So like one thing that people probably don't realize is that major sporting events usually increases sex trafficking exponentially, because people are traveling in from out of town. Any big city, a lot of times you have a lot of tourism, so you have people coming in from all over, but then it's also a labor issue because a lot of those places have tons of jobs and not enough people to work them. But I kind of wanted to get into, you know, I guess my background, how I found out about it. When I was in college, my Greek advisor had a book that she recommended called Half the Sky. And this has now been, there's actually an exhibit that I don't know if it's still touring around because I saw it back when I was in college, but it was an actual, they turned it into like an exhibit. And then it's also been turned into a movie, but it's written by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wooden. And they do a lot. I think Nicholas actually writes for New York Times, but they travel all over the world and hear stories from people. And they actually have tried to rescue women out of these situations. So this book in particular is a little bit more of a global perspective, but again, it is something that still happens in the United States. And the whole concept of the book is that women hold up half the sky, that when you actually give women the resources and the education that men get in every other part of the world, that you end up having a much more balanced and sustainable society. Otherwise, you end up in cases where like fathers are literally selling off their daughters into human trafficking for money, or, marrying them off really young. And then they end up, having children too young and having health. It's just like a snowball effect. But then here in the US, you oftentimes see people that go into relationships, and they usually seek out women who already have maybe issues with their self-esteem, or maybe they don't really have a lot of family around them. Maybe they're like a single mom and they have to work multiple jobs to sustain the household for their kid. And they'll start dating them, build trust with them, and then slowly start nudging them into the life of human trafficking. And at that point, you can't get out because they've removed you from all of your potential resources to help you out. But I think it's really important to also not only educate yourself, because obviously that's the point of all of this, but even to, know what to look for. And I know there's, hotlines and everything that you can call if you think that you're seeing human trafficking. Obviously there is some corruption in both politics and the police departments. There have definitely been cases where, they've been linked to helping out or maybe turning a blind eye to issues of human trafficking. I think our third part of the series is going to be kind of touching on some of the more famous cases that we've heard. And then the second part of the series is going to be talking about recidivism specifically, because the other issue that we run into is that we work really hard to rescue these women out of these situations, and the rate at which they go back into human trafficking by choice is insane. So we're going to touch on the psychology behind that as well. But I think looking at, the country, and I think Toledo might be the number one city in the country, but I always want to highlight anytime we're talking about, Ohio being number 3 in the country or whatever it is, that a lot of times that also is a direct indicator that that state has some kind of task force or laws in place in order to seek out the cases of human trafficking and do something about it. So usually when you see those states that are in higher numbers, it's usually because they're actually doing something about it. So they actually have the data for those numbers. Although it's also an indicator because Ohio has 75 and 70 coming together. So it's a high traffic area because major interstate. But I wanted to go ahead and see if anybody else had anything to chime in. I don't want to take all of this because I could talk about it all day.
I've got, and some of it's been covered, and I want to shout out Safe Horizon for Works Cited. I also did grab a hotline from them. There's probably multiple, but 1-800-621-HOPE is just one of the many hotlines that you can call if you see any of this stuff. But I thought this was interesting. And again, we've said some of it already, but 3 sets of bullet points here. Traffickers use a variety of coercive methods to control their victims. And we've mentioned several of these, such as luring their victims with false promises of economic opportunity, withholding identifications, work authorizations, or travel documents, demanding repayment for a real or alleged debt, using or threatening to use violence, monitoring, and surveillance activities. And then, like Richie was saying, paying very little or not at all for hard work. Trafficked victims may be forced to live in subpar living conditions or the same place that they work, not be able to talk to anyone alone or without supervision, be coached on how to respond to inquiries from others, including police and other authority figures. And then the third set is the part that I know we hadn't gotten to as much, and it's states, and this is again from Safe Horizon, regardless of immigration status, all people that work in the United States have the right to be paid at least the minimum wage, a safe and healthy workplace, not be held in a job against their will, keep their passport and other identification documents in their possession, report abuse without retaliation, leave an abusive employment situation, and get help from unions, immigrant and labor rights groups, and other organizations. So I know we covered a lot of that already, but it was something that stuck out to me while I was digging through that, I think that's important to remember that, everybody that, regardless of their status, once they're here and they have a job in the United States, they have these same rights, same as everyone else. And it's all of our responsibility to maintain the integrity of the country. In my
Yeah. I just kind of wanted to mention a couple other things. There's some other things we need to consider as well. I think the best way to describe it is it's probably close to a 2/3, where it's 2/3 of it is sex trafficking, 1/3 labor. I'm not exactly sure on that. I'm sure we'll probably talk about that next week just to confirm that. But I believe it's about that number. But you talk about transients. You talk a lot of trafficking comes through homelessness, runaways, things like that. There's so many different layers to how this happens. And since that's what we're referring to, the psychology of it is, just understand, like, there's so many positions where you feel like, like where somebody feels hopeless or they don't have many opportunity, and then they're lied to on an opportunity to feel safe and things like that. And then the disgusting things that happen after the fact of that. So it's like, I think it's very naive to assume, that these people just didn't really understand what's going on. Of course they didn't. They were completely fleeced. Another thing that's really important to mention is that sometimes it's not a criminal organization. Sometimes it's your own family, right? Like that happens a lot too. Fostering happens too, from foster families, from your own family. There's a lot of cases where that's the case. And I'm sure down the road, as we go through this, we'll probably discuss and open that up a little more. But I just like to clarify that it doesn't have to be a criminal organization. Sometimes it's internal. Sometimes it's your family members. Sometimes you were fostered or you're going through that foster system. And then you go through that. That happens a lot. It's very disgusting. And that's what makes it such a challenging thing to deal with, because you can't just combat it from one perspective. There's so many different elements and different disgusting people that are doing this in different ways. Now, with the family sides of things, that's generally where that sex trafficking really hones in, right? Predominantly. But nonetheless, there's so many different people and different types of ways people are manipulated into sex trafficking or labor trafficking, generally sex trafficking. And I'd be remiss to say if we didn't include the fact that it does happen from family members quite a bit. Yeah. So they take advantage of children quite a bit, and like foster systems, etc. So there's a lot going on here. Chelsea mentioned, the bigger cases, and I think Jeffrey Epstein, we'll get into that. But that's for part 3. I'm very excited to have those discussions, because getting back to it right now, it's just surprising to me, I think, how little people really understand how big of a problem this is. And I really want to explore in the upcoming weeks, why it's so challenging, right? It's I think, like, in a vacuum, it's easy and everyone would love to say, let's fix this. But there's so many reasons and perspectives we need to look at as to what's so complicated about it, and how we do need to work on it from a legislation standpoint and the different perspectives. Because like we talked about, there's the entire foster system and like children's services that we have to deal with. We have to deal with the border perspective of things. We have to deal with labor laws. We have to deal with the police departments. We have to deal with so many aspects of this. And I'm looking forward to having those discussions.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, it's important to note that this isn't really like an income bracket specific issue, because from what I've studied, you see, especially people who maybe have like a drug addiction or might even be like in a very abusive relationship where they will literally like traffic out their own child in order to make money for drugs, or just to not have to be beat up by their significant other because they're in a really crappy relationship. So there's that end of the spectrum where it's probably more like lower income, or at least doesn't have a lot of money because they're spending it on something else, such as hard drugs. But you also see it on the other end of the spectrum, which kind of ties into the Jeffrey Epstein that we'll get into later. But money talks. And I actually, when I was living in Tampa, I volunteered for a local organization. I still help them out here and there with some digital marketing stuff. But I met a woman there who had actually been trafficked there in Tampa, and she was trafficked via the waterways, because since the state is completely surrounded pretty much by water, they would traffic women by the boats and take them to the mansions. So if you've ever been in Tampa, you might have driven through the area. Bayshore Boulevard, it's like the longest sidewalk I think in the world or something like that, but it's beautiful. You see the water, but all through that area there's these like multi-million-dollar homes, probably billion, I don't know, I don't even bother to look, but a lot of those people have docks right up to the water, and that's where they would traffic these women. And so she actually got up at an event and told her story about, what exactly happened to her and how she got out of it and everything. But again, it was a psychology type issue where she had kind of been manipulated into this situation, and then she felt like she couldn't get out. But also, they would pay her really well because they have a lot of money. So a lot of times it's like women who end up in a situation where that's their only way to earn money, and it's really good money, but they don't want to do it. And they feel like they don't have another option, that's their only thing that they know how to do. So they're just going to keep doing it. Even if they're miserable and it's not a safe situation, because a lot of times you don't know if you're going to be abused. And when you're, at that point, it's not just sex, it could just be abuse. But I think Riche kind of touched on this. It's the law side of it as well. So there's a lot of states, and Ohio's one of them, that has been working on their legislation. So in the past, one of the things that's been an issue is that cops would basically arrest prostitutes and criminally charge them with something because prostitution isn't legal. Okay. The problem is that a lot of those women were forced into it. It's not that they want to be prostitutes. They have a pimp that's literally saying, if you don't get out there and make so much money on the street, I'll kill you or your family. So then these pimps are all behind the scenes. Cops never see them, or in most cases almost never arrest them, and it's always the women. So then the women end up with these criminal records, and they end up in jail, and they have all these issues. And because they've been so manipulated and abused, they don't want to tell the cops what's happening. They can't trust the cops, at least according to these pimps. And so they just keep doing it. They keep going out and getting arrested, and they have this huge criminal record. Well, just to kind of touch on what's going to be next week, they can't get a job anywhere because they have all these arrest records. So there's been a lot of states that have finally sat down with these different organizations and learned about the psychology behind it and the real problem, the root being the pimps in the situation. And so you've probably started to see stories that come out about entire trafficking rings that are getting arrested. And it's because they'll find ways to infiltrate and get information in order to basically catch the actual problem and then help the women then get out and pursue something that's, safe. But I think there's a lot of states that still have a long way to go with that. I think there's some that have kind of made headway with it, but there's still a lot of room to make some changes. And Marvin, I know you stepped out for a second, but did you have anything else you wanted to chime in with?
No, just to continue to educate myself more on the matter. I think that everything that you said has so much truth behind it. There is a psychology behind it. I know, when these women, fall to drug addiction, it could be, tough to kind of get out of that lifestyle along with, being controlled at the same time. Mm-hmm. So, like you said, more legislation needs to be done. Not just back home in Ohio, but just all across the world. I just feel like it's something that's not really touched on as much. I feel even from other podcasts I listen to, I feel like, we're doing kind of a self-service to the, help towards this finding a solution. Like I said earlier, I'll take that back. Not that I didn't have a solution at the moment, but the solution is, the hotlines, we offer, I will say that, I think that, that's a great place to start. But for now, going into next week, I just want to continue to educate myself on the matter. I really think that it's something that really needs to be, taken more seriously.
Yeah, and I was just doing a search because I've watched a lot of documentaries, but over the years I can't remember all the different names of them. But there's a ton. I know Netflix has had a couple in the past. I don't know if there's currently any on there. I haven't watched Netflix in a while, but there's definitely a lot of options. A lot of them are even available for free online. You don't have to pay to watch them. It's more there for education. So if you are looking to learn a little bit more and maybe reading isn't your thing, you don't want to read Half the Sky or one of the other books out there, then I would recommend some of the documentaries because they all hit on different facets of the issue Some of them actually interview women that have been rescued out of human trafficking. It touches on quite a bit of information. It can be hard to watch, definitely. And I wouldn't recommend having kids around when you're watching it, obviously. But there's some really, and I don't mean like the movie Taken or anything like that. I mean like the actual documentaries that are talking to these women who have experienced it, because I think that in and of itself would give you a pretty good insight of how mentally messed up these women end up because of the situations that they're in. And once they're out, it's a huge process to try and unwind the manipulation that has been stamped into their minds. So it's definitely a good option if you're trying to educate. I would recommend at least starting there with some of the documentaries.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I think we only have about 6 minutes left. So did anybody else want to add in like some last words about the topic?
Yeah, I'll reiterate the number that we have. And again, there's plenty. You can just use Google, but we've got 1-800-621-HOPE. Again, that's from Safe Horizon. What's resonating to me, and I'm glad that we're going to be spending 3 weeks on this, and I feel like that could even be light-handed when it comes to discussing such an important topic. It is one of the biggest businesses in this world, and that's disgusting. And if you look at the content of everyone's discussion, whether it be social media, on the news, and political debates, it's nowhere to be found. Why? Because a lot of them have their hand in it, have their pockets involved in it, rely on it for some sort of income. You need to realize how important this is and how it could happen to someone just like you or someone that you love. And even if it doesn't hit home in that standpoint, I ask you to open up your heart and realize that there are humans, real people that do not have a choice but to live these lives. And it's our responsibility to do something about it.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I think hopefully as we continue to discuss this over the weeks, for some of our listeners, this will be kind of a change in perspective and optics. Chelsea kind of mentioned about prostitution, right? A lot of the times people denigrate and look down on the prostitutes when the reality is they're just a symptom of the actual reality of the criminal organizations that like cause these prostitutes to happen. And again, as she mentioned, the prostitute isn't wanting to prostitute. Let's clarify this, people, right? They're kind of forced into it, and then it ruins their life. And these organizations just abduct or coerce people into that again, and they just keep doing this and perpetuating this, and they make money off of these people. It's a symptomatic thing that happens in every country, ours included. And I'm looking forward to discussing it. And hopefully, if you haven't been paying attention to it, over the next 2 weeks, as we discuss on like how people fall back into the lifestyle and then like lead into the heavier conversations of, for instance, Jeffrey Epstein and like larger cases where if you didn't even see it then, you're going to pay attention to it now. So I'm hopefully looking forward to people keeping an open mind as we discuss this.
Yeah. And I do want to clarify too that I don't want to imply that all like prostitution and sex work is human trafficking. I think that there are women out there that truly do enjoy doing that. And I don't have a problem with that. Girl, you do you. But I do think it is also important to keep in mind that because of the nature of that business and how a lot of people do look down, like Riche said, on prostitution, it's kind of like a hush-hush topic. You don't have people that want to admit the fact that they've been trafficked, that they've basically been a prostitute, even if it was against their will. And that's part of the reason why a lot of times these things go unreported, not only because they feel threatened by their pimp, but also because they're ashamed. And I think some of that is our societal view. A lot of times like sex is a taboo topic in this country. And I think that's slowly changing over time. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we're not implying that all prostitution and sex work is also human trafficking. It's just that that's often how it's displayed, and it's hard to identify the difference. So, Marvin, was there any last word that you wanted other than doing more research? I wasn't sure. I don't want to talk over you.
No. Looking forward to learning more in the weeks ahead on this topic, and next week, doing more, more of my homework on an issue that is, like Justin said, one of the biggest businesses, in the world. And, you don't want to contribute to the problem not knowing what's going on. So, from now to then, I'll leave that as my responsibility, to educate myself more on this matter.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to close out and just say, I first became really passionate about this because thinking about it, I think any kind of sex-related crime is the worst thing that you can really do to a person other than taking their life. I feel like that is a level of violation that it lives with you forever. So I became very passionate about wanting to help people that have dealt with this because I think it's very hard to go through and I can't begin to fathom what it would be like to try to move on with your life after experiencing any kind of sex crime. So I hope everybody, it wasn't too heavy of a topic, but I hope everybody joins us next week to join us for part 2 to talk about recidivism with human trafficking. That's the H2G podcast. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow.